From Flourish DX School, this is the Flourishing at School podcast. With mental health becoming a global priority, we are your partner for creating schools where students, teachers, and school leaders feel good and function well, becoming the best versions of themselves and contributing to a flourishing world.
Welcome to the Flourishing at School podcast. I'm Tamara Lechner. Each week, my co-host Jason Van Schie and I bring you the best practitioners, academics, and everything in between in order to inform best practice in whole school mental health. So Jason, I know you're really sick of my well-being questions, but I have a different one this time. I'm interested. I have well-being idols. So I have Deepak Chopra, who I trained under, and I'm like, this man is so, not only does he feel good, but he functions well. He is the most prolific writer I know. So he's one of my heroes. And my second one is Barry Neil Kaufman, who is kind of a happiness guy who started me down the journey of positive psychology, not to be confused with Scott Barry Kaufman. Similar names, but different guys. So they're my well-being idols. Do you have a well-being idol?
Oh, yeah, I wouldn't say a well-being idol. I would say I like people who call out crap, and there's a lot of crap out there. So there's a lot of solutions providers just looking for problems to fix, rather than doing good evidence-based practice, which is like doing a good diagnosis of the problem and then actually developing a solution that tackles the problem at the root cause. And so there's, I wouldn't call them idols, but I'd say they're now actually really great mates and peers in the industry. So people like David Burrows here locally, Professor Tony LaMontagne from Deakin University, they've both been very prominent in calling out stuff that's very individual, wellness focused in a workplace context, right? When the employer isn't first looking at, hey, actually, how are we creating sustainable work practices that don't cause people burnout, versus obviously putting the onus on individuals to thrive in a toxic environment. So I like those people who call out crap.
Awesome. It's a theme that we have going in our podcast series. So I'm going to ask our guest the same question in a minute, but first I'm going to introduce her. I'm excited to have Amy Eva with us today. Amy is the Associate Education Director at the Greater Good Science Center out of Berkeley. And Amy, sometime I will tell you my journey to the Greater Good Science Center. When I visited Berkeley, I went around looking for it. And for anyone who's gone around looking for it, it's kind of in a nursery daycare in the middle of nowhere. And it's not the Mecca that I was expecting it to be. So Amy is an educational psychologist. She has 25 years in classrooms. She is a writer, and I think she's going to tell us about a new book that she has. And I cannot wait to hear more from Amy. But let's start out. Do you have a well-being idol, Amy?
Oh my goodness. Oh, thanks so much for the invite. I'm so excited to talk to you both tonight. I love this question because I geek out on well-being. That's my life's work. I think the first person who actually popped into my mind is someone, because I study adult and education professional well-being primarily. That's my passion. I do a lot of other things. But one of the people I really admire in that field is Elena Aguilar. She wrote a book called Onward, all about emotional resilience in educators. And that actually motivated some of my work. And the book that I just wrote called Surviving Teacher Burnout, I must say I admire Dr. Keltner, who happens to lead the Greater Good Science Center and studies awe and emotions and well-being, and is the founding director of where I work and leads a podcast called The Science of Happiness. So he's another person. There's so many people. It would take the hour just talking about all my heroes, my well-being heroes.
Yeah, there's lots out there. Dakar's one, he didn't come to mind right away, but he's certainly one for me as well. I love not only the work he does, but the way he presents it. When Jason and I have been at IPA, the International Positive Psychology Conference, before, and so many of the researchers and presenters do not embody any aspect of feeling good and functioning well. And I think Dakar really does. So you're right in bringing that one, pointing him out as a good role model for sure.
He also has the Berkeley hippie chill kind of vibe as well.
I think I'm attracted to that.
But it's so true. He really looks the look of kind of Berkeley, and yeah, has a calm presence.
Maybe the term idol doesn't resonate with me because I'm Australian. So we have tall poppy syndrome here. We don't like people getting too high and mighty, and it's kind of like,
Yeah.
well, let's cut them down. And maybe that's why my idols are more the people that cut down the idols versus, being an idol themselves.
I can roll with that too, Jason. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, nice. Hey, Amy, for the listeners that aren't familiar with your work and the Greater Good Centre, can you maybe share with us a little bit about yourself in a few minutes?
Before Greater Good or Greater Good
Yeah,
specifically?
what brought you to Greater Good?
Sure, yeah. Actually, my bio is a little outdated. I'm a 30-year educator at this point. 1993 was when I first launched into my first teaching as a graduate student in a master's program in literature. So originally, my passion was literature, and I hoped to teach that. But I also, in undergrad, did a degree in psychology and then a master's in literature as well. And I ended up, after teaching high school for a while, high school language arts, I ended up going to the University of Washington in Seattle and getting my doctorate in educational psychology. And there I pulled together my passions for literature, teaching, and psychology in one degree. And at the time, this was in early 2000s, I studied the psychology of reading, actually, and how people process and read poetry and how they can tap their emotions to really better understand literature. And that was a launching point for more work, actually, on mindfulness. I moved into the field of mindfulness. I think there's a connection there. I think that presence to art and the written word and being with the written word it connects for me with mindful presence. And in the early 2000s, I started studying mindfulness as I was a teacher educator by that time at Seattle University, here where I live. And for 12 years, I was a teacher educator working with pre-service teachers, working with them on the psychology of teaching and learning and adolescent psych. And 6 years ago, I landed at the Greater Good Science Center. I kind of thought that I wanted to change and I wanted to do more on the ground work, not as maybe ivory tower as perhaps some of my work was at the time. And I landed this dream job. I get to study and translate research on what it means to live a purposeful and meaningful life. And I get to look at studies, translate them in written blog style, user-friendly pieces. I get to teach and facilitate workshops with in-service teachers on the science of social and emotional well-being and mindfulness and character education. And all of my work is about well-being and the greater good, which is kind of ideal.
Well, it sounds like you're blending all of your background, right? Like education and teaching, psychology, literature, like because you're creating content. It's a great blend of, I guess, everything that has brought you to this point, right?
Yeah, thanks for saying that. That I would agree. It is sort of coming to fruition, some of these different skills and passions in my life. And I absolutely adore the work that I get to do. I don't love working remotely, to be frank, because I'm very much a teacher at heart, and being face to face with people like you live is even better than on Zoom. I spend a lot of time writing, and so I miss that day-to-day consistent connection with groups of people.
Amy, has your work always been remote, or is that a post-pandemic thing?
It's actually, I was hired remotely for Greater Good before remote was a big thing with the pandemic. And now a lot of the staff at my organization are actually remote, as are many, right, across the globe. So yeah, I've only been a remote worker for 6 years, and I do have the opportunity to travel and do workshops and consulting around all the tools that we have on offer at Greater Good for adult and student well-being.
Well, that's a perfect segue, because the next thing I was going to ask you, you've kind of gone through your career trajectory, and where you sit now is a place that offers free resources and all kinds of blogs and positive psychology interventions and downloads and workshops. Can you tell us a bit about this smorgasbord of everything teachers need to feel good and function well and teach well and be well?
Yes, it has become a bit of a smorgasbord over the last 6 years. So I'll try to really think of your listeners and what would be most useful to them. I will say that Greater Good Science Center, our team works with the general public in terms of sharing happiness practices and well-being practices, but I'm part of a smaller team that works specifically in creating resources for K-12 teachers and folks in higher ed. And when I say teachers, I actually am meaning all education professionals, counselors, admins, etc. And if you go to a site like Greater Good in Education, which we created a couple of years ago, it has between 250 and 300 free practices on it. You will find a whole column for adult well-being, student well-being, relationships, academic connections to social and emotional well-being, and I may be missing a category, but you'll also find topics like how to teach, or practices focused on compassion, self-compassion, empathy, bridging differences, gratitude, purpose, all these keys to well-being. We have practices to share with students of all ages and with adults connected to those areas or those themes. And each practice, I think it's important to say, for those of us who are still making the argument to our schools and our families about the relevance of these practices, each practice has a research section, just a short paragraph that explains the research behind the practice and why it's really important for students or adults to engage in this learning experience. So that's really helpful too.
I love your site. I love the way it's organized, and I think it is so unbelievably helpful. You can tell I'm a fan. What I wonder is how, with all of that, how you decide what gets in there, because there's so much to choose from. And you said 250. It feels like there's so many more. How do you pick?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Many of our practices are specifically translated from research studies. So there's a really effective social belonging intervention that folks are using in colleges to help kids who or young adults who feel like they don't belong connect better in schools. So we might take that intervention and translate it into a practice, or we'll have a researcher help us do it. So we have very much research-based practices, and then we have more research-informed practices that aren't direct translations of research, but that perhaps have been vetted and or used by other organizations. So all of the practices on our site are not ours. They are ones that we partner with people around the world to share practices from organizations like, one of the big ones actually is SEL Kernels. Have you all heard of the SEL Kernels, Stephanie Jones? So Stephanie Jones at Harvard, and she has an easel lab, and she has put together these very small bite-sized practices that are focused on cognitive, emotional, character. It's like feelings power, brain power, citizen power. I might be getting some of the titles incorrect, but she focuses on all these different areas of well-being and has designed and researched and vetted with teachers over many years, K-6 teachers, the practices, and they're all housed on our site now, which is really lovely. And they're some of the most popular practices on our site, which are the most research-based and frequently used.
I love the easel stuff, and I know that K to 12 We see a lot more in those K-6 years, but I think it's really important to say that you've got the full gamut on there. It's not just for the wee ones. You've got lots for all ages.
Yeah, I have a special passion for adolescents, as I used to teach adolescent psych, and I have 3 young adults in my household. So when I thought that I knew all there was to know about adolescent psych, I got remarried and blended my family and have had 3 teenagers to test out all my theories on. I do more work in the area of adolescent, actually, psychology, and we do have some lovely middle school, high school, college level practices. Our self-compassion practices, I don't know if either of you know Karen Bluth, but she has some amazing work in self-compassion. We have some of her practices on the site. That's our most popular one, is the self-compassion practice for teens right now.
So we had Karen's colleague, Lisa Bayless, on a few episodes ago, and Karen was out at Geelong Grammar when I was working there. And so I love Karen and her work. And it's kind of funny because when you think of teenagers, my judgment would be teenagers don't like self-compassion. Like that's not going to be cool for them. And yet it does seem to be something they're really drawn to, and in a way that surprises me all the time. And I'm a meditator. I'm a person who believes in these things. So, I love Karen's work, and I'm glad that you've got lots of it on there.
Amy, given that this is the Flourishing at School podcast, I'm particularly interested to hear about how you're supporting staff and student wellbeing at this time through some of the resources that you have on the website.
Yeah, you know where we really are right now at Greater Good? We, like many of you educators out there, and we have spent a lot of time over the last few years focused on creating online resources that are really helpful. As you said, Tamara, they can be overwhelming, right? I think many of us have access to resources, but not necessarily all the tools or support to really dig in and connect with one another around them. So our next big step at Greater Good Science Center is to develop a communities of practice program. So what we want to do is, rather than just having like a data repository of practices or asynchronous online courses, we want to get teachers or education professionals together in the next 3 or 4 years for connection and some really lovely, helpful content, but also connection and support. And so I'm launching a community of practice around adult well-being in schools with Dr. Allison Briscoe-Smith coming up in January. Low lift, just an hour and a half a month where people can have a little bit of rest and reflection, and we can share resources with them. And I just think that we as adults in this field, we absolutely need each other right now so much. And we've been isolated by the pandemic as already. The work for many is very overwhelming. And so I just feel very, very passionate about not just self-care and flourishing on our own, but what does it take to flourish in community, and how can we support each other in community and build each other up? I don't think we can navigate this alone. And I think we teachers tend to be isolated. I know I was when I started off.
Yeah, I've noticed there's an overwhelming appetite to do in-person again. And, we're running an event this Thursday and only decided last Monday to do it. And even though it's almost Christmas and people have other things on, we've got, over 30 people coming along at very short notice, because I think there's just this appetite to learn and be connected to people after such a big absence of that from our lives, and so much virtual, right?
May I ask you all questions?
Sure,
you
go
may.
for it, Amy.
I'm just so fascinated right now with the question of the challenge of how do we create a meaningful, nurturing, emotionally intimate space with other teachers or education professionals online. We're thinking a lot about that as we launch our new community of practice program. And I just wondered if you all had insights on that yourselves. I have biases toward face-to-face, and I want to do a good job with online, and we're working on it.
Yeah, interestingly, we actually have our own community of practice for a program, which is what we're calling a catalyst program for psychological health and safety. So taking more of a systemic view of workplace mental health versus like the individual self-care approach. And we've got 8 companies, and we have project leads from each of those companies who meet once a fortnight as part of that. And I don't normally take part in that because I've got my colleagues who coordinate it, but last week they were unavailable, so they said, Jason, can you do it? And we start off with, what went well. Like we do a what went well, like what's gone well in the last couple of weeks. And you know what? It was just amazing, the amount of like great things that have been going on, but the support that each of them were giving. And this is, about 3 months now into this community of practice. And so they're very comfortable with sharing and being really supportive and like kind of getting to understand each other. And they're now finding opportunities to connect with each other one-on-one as well outside of the community event. So, I think it's not particularly hard. If you can find a community of like-minded people who want to come together on the regular and develop that relationship and do things that we know that works, like share what's working, like share challenges that you're going through and help through the power of groupthink kind of work out how to overcome them. It doesn't have to be hugely formulaic or, have a massive agenda. It's like just getting those people together and kind of sharing. I'm not sure if that's the answer you want, Amy, but I've really enjoyed, participating in this, our own community practice that we've been running.
And it's interesting because I've worked in 2 fairly large online communities that have only ever met online, and one was really bad, and the other was better. And part of it was to do with the space we met. So you don't always have control if you're on Zoom or if you're what type of meeting space you have. But I'm part of a technology company, and as a part of a group called the Founders Institute, we tried one out that was very different than any other platform. And we were able to, instead of the typical breakout room where when you're in Zoom, it's okay, and now off you go, and you're in your rooms, and you're not really sure what's going on, and all of a sudden somebody yanks you back out when you're in the middle of a very good conversation. This was set up more like round tables, and you could see all of the round tables, and every once in a while, a little hint would pop up about what that table was talking about. So kind of like you're at a cocktail party, and you hear somebody over there is talking about autonomy, and you think, oh, I would like to go and join that conversation. And you could actually do that in this space because you would get little hints about, okay, that's what this table is talking about. And so I think it's a combination of how you're encouraging people to show up and then also making sure that every voice is heard, because I've been on some of the Harvard Community of Practice meetings where some of my friends who are real introverts say, I just don't process quickly enough to ever say anything in that setting, that you've got all these big thinkers who show up and are extroverted and really want to talk, and they
the
find
classic teacher dilemma.
Totally, right? And so I think it is about how do we, I do a lot of voting with your screens, like turning your screens on and off, and whiteboarding and letting people share that way. So those are things that I've learned from others that I enjoyed, and I've tried to pass them along. And I'm with you. I still think in person is awesome. And I am looking for, I haven't been to a conference since the whole pandemic, and I'm really looking forward to starting some conferences in 2023.
Oh, I just had my first. It was such a high to actually be teaching face-to-face again. And I should follow up with both of you and say, like, one of the reasons why I'm asking that question is because another big project I'm involved with, which may be of interest to you and the listeners, is that I'm part of a grant with the state of California in the U.S. called the CalHope Support Program. And we have the task of running and facilitating communities of practice across the entire state with all 58 county offices of education. And so our communities tend to be quite large in Zoom breakout rooms or Zoom, and we use breakout rooms. And I've also, Tamara, tested a platform called Circles, which sounds like a smaller version of what you described, where you're with 8 to 10 people in a literal circle. You talk to each other. You can actually give each other hugs by hovering over one person, and all of the icons come and kind of surround a person. There's some lovely little elements to circles, but it's not cost effective for us, for example, with a huge group of people. And I just crave creating those more intimate groupings when we have a group of 80, for example, in a community of practice.
I would think that having smaller groups, like within that group of 80, who become kind of like their own little cohort, so not just using breakout rooms, but because otherwise it's too hard to get familiar with everyone. In a
Our
group
long-standing practice, Jason, is creating families. We call them families. And so that's role-alike groups who are put together, groups of like 6 to 10 people, and they follow each other through the entire experience, and they tend to stay connected, beyond our time together.
Yeah, I think that's good practice, right? Rather than just mixing it up every time, having the same family go through together, I think would create stronger bonds.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
It's so important to have that sense of these are my people, and you have someone to talk with. And I guess this brings me to my next question, Amy, which piggybacks really well on what you just asked us. If I'm a school and I'm coming to you and I want to get started, I haven't really done well-being or social emotional learning in my school, what's something that you've seen a school do to get started that works really well?
Wow, that's a great question. I will say that as an educational psychologist and teacher educator, I am not an implementation specialist. I won't claim to be one. And I will also say that our site is designed very specifically not to be a scripted curriculum of any kind. We have the bias that teachers are incredibly talented, smart, nimble, flexible humans who know their people, and they need tools and kernels like Stephanie Jones kernels, practices to share and adapt for their respective groups. And so we don't have a scripted journey through the greater good and education materials. We do have coursework, foundational coursework. For example, in social emotional learning, character ed, mindfulness, we have a key capstone course called Teaching and Learning for the Greater Good that gives you a sense of the whole of the themes that we explore in greater good in education. And that's why we're launching the Communities of Practice, to help to study a little bit more about how people are implementing our resources. But to try to get more concrete in answering your question, if I were a K-6 teacher, I would go through some of the topic pages on our site and get a little bit of grounding in the research behind things like SEL, self-compassion, purpose, meaning, and then look at a couple suggested practices within each of those areas. I would look at the SEL kernels, but again, we don't have a scripted journey, so I'd really have to talk more with an individual about their school and what their needs are. Some of the most effective practices that folks are most responsive to happen to be also our gratitude practices in terms of building trust and connectedness at school, whether they're shared among staff or students. If you really want to focus more on your school climate and belonging and appreciation and connectedness, those I think are a nice place to spend some energy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We have in Flourishing at School, we have a strength spotting that is quite similar to a gratitude that you can find one of your colleagues or one of your classmates and spot a strength in them. And I know that people love giving and receiving thanks and being noticed for what they're good at and their strengths. So I think you're absolutely right that is a great place to begin. It's also a great place to end. It's kind of I always say it's the meta, right? That if you can be giving thanks or noticing something good, you're on the right path. So that is a good place to start. And Jason and I would both agree with you about not having a prescriptive path, because we know that doesn't work. There is not a one size fits all solution. Unfortunately, we all wish there was. It would make it a whole lot easier to help schools. Yeah. Yeah.
I would say too, though, if I could share material from Greater Good, I think one of the first places I would go would be the science of emotions and what we know and what we have on offer around that. When I think about the profound struggles that we're facing with mental health globally and with students' mental health, there are a lot of great programs to help people, kids and adults, think about and identify and label and learn to navigate their emotions. But I really think that's kind of your 101 if you're looking at basic mental health and flourishing, is how do we think about our emotions? How do we learn to be responsive and compassionate and good listeners as we engage with each other's emotions? So if I were to kind of do a 101, I might go there first.
Yeah, nice one. Hey, Amy, I am interested because we always ask our guests, what have you tried that didn't work? So do you have any fails that you're willing to own up to our audience?
Sure. That's such an important part of all of our learning. I wish we'd do this more with each other, like share our trip ups and mistakes, because that's at the heart of learning.
Well, exactly. You got to be comfortable trying, right?
Right.
And if you're always worried about failure, then you're not going to try anything new.
Absolutely. And kids, I think, are the culture of school often isn't conducive to that, and I've written lots about that too. But fails. Okay, I've kind of tiptoed around one of the things that feels like a failure, but it is a learning, and that is that I anticipated that some of our online courses would really be just picked up and absolutely loved and adored and appreciated, our asynchronous courses. But my goodness, aren't we all exhausted with online? I don't know. Through COVID, we're actually seeing also our magazine at Greater Good and some of the uptake of our materials going down, as is every other online resource, because we're starting to get outdoors again, and we were much more connected to online, but now we're coming out of our COVID caves, and there's more opportunity for connection. And so a fail for us is not like a micro level school fail, but I think a learning for us has been not to lean as much on online asynchronous, but more on that human connection that we all are there for in the first place at Greater Good Science Center. So how can we facilitate more connective experiences and emotional support that way?
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I got to say, we sometimes, or quite often, get customer feedback about features that they want. And one that we would get quite a bit from schools, at least, is, how do we get parents involved in this? And, are you going to come up with parent resources? And we spent a lot of time creating this parent portal with education resources and all this. And like yourself, Amy, I thought, there's appetite for this. Like, a lot of schools are asking for it. But when they started promoting it to parents, just nothing. So, yes, it's online resources are one thing, but people have so much choice these days, right? They can go to TikTok or YouTube or whatever. It's very hard just to have a hub on a website where you put resources. As good as the Greater Good Science Centre is, and one of our go-to resources for sure, there's just so much to choose from. So, yes, I have also been similarly over optimistic about how an online resource might land, and it's failed.
Oh man, one of the things we've also done, and we're working on right now, is a journey through some of our resources for California schools through our Cal Hope support program. So we ended up very quickly during this mental health crisis in 2020 creating modules to walk people through different adult facilitation experiences that they could turnkey for their people across the state around 6 different themes. So caring for ourselves as adults, safety and belonging, trauma and healing-centered practices, racial equity and cultural responsiveness. And we did it on the fly, and we did it sprinting. And now we're going back and we're sort of giving them another look and a more thoughtful look so that perhaps we can launch all these modules across beyond California. But again, I think it comes back to our face-to-face support of each other in trying and experimenting with these well-being practices and sharing resources and research with each other and sharing our experiences, because that's where it's going to start sticking for us.
Yeah, I hear that. Got to get beyond just the online superficial stuff and start making more of those deeper experiential connections.
Yeah.
I do think this is someplace we can learn from the students because they're doing it. They have better skills at developing real relationships. I've interviewed 2 people today who I've never met before, and I don't think of people that I know of online as my friends, but my kids do. And they have figured out a way to relate and feel close. And I think we've seen a lot of this with the diversity, equity, inclusion movements that are happening around the world, that actually there's a whole language being spoken that the adults have to learn that the kids already know. And so I think part of this is going to be kind of flipping that classroom a little bit and saying, okay, what can we learn from you and how you use these different apps and finding. I also think that eventually we'll have some type of regulation around what can happen online. Right now, I mean, the filters and the this and the that, the deep fakes, eventually we're going to have some policing of that will help us. But in the meantime, I do think that if we learn from the kids and figure out, okay, how can we create these great communities? Because clearly you're doing it. You've got a kid in the middle of nowhere who's never met another transgender person, but is talking to transgender people all around the globe and feels like they have a very close group of people who are giving them a hug, in your circles hugs or however. They feel like that's happening. And so I think that's something I would like to learn from them. And I have a really curious and open mind around how I can learn from what they're doing well. And so this brings me to one of the final questions that I like to ask our guests. And it's going to be a little different for you because you're not working in one school. But something that I like to consider is if you've done your job right. So if you've gotten everything right at the Greater Good Science Center's education arm, how would you know?
Oh, wow. We have logic models that end in like glorious outcomes. We think big picture at Greater Good, not shockingly. Our goal is to help support and create compassionate, thriving, and a resilient society, and an equitable one. Especially the education team, we're very much focused on equity. My dream would, and we wouldn't be responsible for it, we would just play a teeny little role in it, is that, I just so deeply want students and education professionals to all feel a sense of hope right now, a sense of their own inherent dignity, to feel that they can flourish, their voices are valued, their passions are valued. So I think we'd see it in the human connection. We'd see it in the ways students and adults connect at school, and it would have a ripple effect. We're very focused on pro-sociality, on what does it mean to live a meaningful and purposeful life where we are connected to and wanting to be kind and helpful to one another, and we're honoring each other's humanity. So, I mean, we think big, but, we would only play a little role in facilitating that.
You can only make big change if you think big and dream big. And I love that it starts with that hope, right? I talk a lot about hope being that emotion that you can go to even in the toughest of times. And we've needed a lot of it in the last few years. So I think you've got a good launching pad, Amy, to actually play a bigger role. Even though I know you and your colleagues will say it's little, I think there's huge potential there, and I'm really grateful for the resources that you offer.
My book's called Surviving Teacher Burnout that just came out a couple months ago, but I would have called it Teaching with Hope if I could have. The publishers wanted it to be more marketable, but I would have called it Teaching with Hope, and hope is the framework for my thinking too around adult well-being and educator well-being. And in Charles Snyder's hope theory is really simple, that that hope is basically an action and a way of thinking, and it doesn't just kind of a light on your shoulder and suddenly make things better, right? It's being able to have a will, agency thinking, I can do this, and a way, pathway thinking, like I see a way forward, I see the obstacles ahead, but I know that there may be some ways to navigate those. So and so I have 52 weeks worth of really bite-sized strategies for education professionals in this book. Just a little bit of like a common challenge we face around a particular theme, a research-based action, and some reflection on that action all 52 weeks of the year. And I tried to make it really user-friendly and action-oriented, but easy and low lift, because I can't tell you how many times I have heard educators say, do not tell me to put self-care as another thing on my to-do list. Like, do not. And so I'm trying to encourage people in really simple ways to support each other with really simple strategies for increasing compassion or purpose or navigating emotions, whatever it may be. And I have this deep hope that we can do more to support each other around that, because Jason, I know you're an organizational psychologist. That's not my field. We have so much work to do system-wide that is not my expertise, but at least I can offer simple things that we can control internally and in our relationships with each other to help us navigate as we work toward a bigger picture reform in our schools.
Yeah, and I think that's important. And I can't remember who we spoke to about this previously, whether it was on this podcast or on our Psych Health and Safety podcast. But, systemic change, like you say, sometimes is big and hard and takes a while. And we can't wait for that as individuals to occur if if we want to look after our own well-being. So we still need, some way of addressing our well-being in the moment, rather than waiting for something else to change in our environment. And we're just talking, actually, Tamara and I, with a previous guest, around how resilient teachers will leave a toxic environment because they'll realise it's not good for their health. So we have to be mindful of, actually, as an education system, we can't just give people self-care tools and resilience skills, because otherwise we're not going to have a teaching profession if we're not also simultaneously improving the systems that we've got.
Absolutely. I wholeheartely agree with that. Yeah.
Hey, I'm just conscious of time, Amy, and this has been fantastic talking to you. I've been a big fan of the Greater Good Science Centre for such a long time. I actually have been to Berkeley once, but went to a cafe and met someone who was actually on a sabbatical working out of Berkeley, but never actually got onto campus, unfortunately. But got all the way over there from Perth, right, and didn't actually go on campus. But can you maybe share one or two podcasts or books that you're reading at the moment that our listeners might find valuable?
Yes. Well, I'm not a big podcast person yet. I'm just sort of building in me. So this is a great experience for me right now to be with both of you. But I can't help but promote our Science of Happiness podcast at Greater Good. But we have a whole new thing we're doing, which is called a happiness break, which is much shorter and more bite-sized. So we're sharing 5-6 minute practices with the general public that are maybe mindfulness-based practices. They could be connected to meaning and purpose. And I'm using those much more in my work with teachers, because they're bite-sized, and we teachers want not a 30-minute mindfulness practice for our class or our staff meeting. So really lovely practices in our happiness breaks from Greater Good Science Center. Can we go beyond education?
Oh,
Sure.
yeah. We love going beyond.
Well, I am obsessed with one podcast, and We Can Do Hard Things with Glennon Doyle and Abby Wambach. It feeds my soul in ways that are quite profound as a woman, I think, and as someone who, they have a nice social justice, diversity, equity, inclusion focus, and they talk about the daily stuff of life that we all are grappling with as
Did
humans.
you hear their episode with Martha Beck and Rowan Mangan?
Yes, and Martha Beck, I think.
Yeah, Martha's one of my favorite people, and I know her from the Chopra Center. But I loved that episode.
That was a great double date.
It was.
Back and forth. Yeah, I love that one. If I had time, I'd probably listen to some crime drama podcasts, to be honest, but I don't have a lot of time for that.
Yeah, in Perth, we have to travel a bit to get anywhere. So yeah, I do listen to podcasts like a fiend, and I listen to them for all different reasons, right? To learn about, organizational psychology, well-being, entrepreneurship, love things about building businesses. But at the moment, I've got to say my guilty pleasure is listening to The Rewatcher, which is all about Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Oh my goodness. I like how we're going lowbrow now.
I was a teenager in the 90s and lived through weekly waiting for Buffy to come out. And it's such great nostalgia. It's fantastic.
I love it. I don't know if we have time left, but I just got to go to an amazing conference hosted by Greater Good, a live in-person conference. It was so fun to be with humans, right? So it was about intellectual humility, that ability to be able to say, I might not be right, and maybe I need to change my mind. It was featuring journalists and podcasters and researchers, and they got together and ideated around, how can we spread more helpful information in light of the political polarization that's going on in this country. And there were lots of really great podcasters there. And there was one podcast called Braver Angels that I'm interested in spending more time with, where they're really digging into political polarization and how do we bridge differences across political difference in particular, and really openly listen to one another. So I have my head in that bridging differences space right now too, in a number of other projects. So.
Very cool. We'd like to hear something different from the old Adam Grant and Brené Brown. So, you've given us a few other things to listen to and broaden our horizons.
Oh, good.
And not that Adam and Brené aren't awesome, but our first 6 or 7 guests all said, "Oh, Brené Brown, Adam Grant." that was the breadth of all of our listening. So we've definitely got some new ones. Thank you for sharing those.
Great.
Well, I think that about brings us to the end, unless there was anything else that we missed that you wanted to talk about, Amy.
No, I think I am excited about the title of your podcast, that it's focused on flourishing, and that I just have this deep desire that we, in the positive psych world, think beyond the individual's flourishing and really think more profoundly and deeply from a sociological, organizational perspective about what are the contexts and conditions that create human flourishing, that make people feel empowered to say, yes, I belong in this space. Yes, I have a voice, and I can be well here because I feel safe here. I love that you're doing that work and that you're broadening the conversation around flourishing.
Oh, thank you for
You're
that.
our people, Amy.
Yeah, we need to meet in person. So the next time we get Jason across the pond, we need to have a meeting of minds. I think we would be great in person. We'll do another episode and we'll record in person. Awesome.
That would be lovely.
It would.
And I can
that
ask
brings
more
us.
questions.
I would like that. That brings us to the end of this episode of the Flourishing at School podcast. If you've been listening, don't forget you can also watch us on YouTube. The Flourish DX YouTube channel has all our episodes. And you can find us on social media. Jason and I are mostly on LinkedIn. Amy, do you do social media at all?
Yes.
Where would people find you?
I'm on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn's probably the best space. I don't want to claim the other social media space right now.
I'm with you. I left it. I quit. So find us there. We'd love to talk to you. We look forward to talking to one another again. That is it for today. And until the next episode, keep flourishing at school and in life.
You've been listening to the Flourishing at School podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on whole school mental health, follow Flourish DX School on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Flourishing at School podcast at www.flourishingatschool.com.